The mansion was immense, but the silence inside had the weight of stone. Since Helena left, Leah and Lara, the 4-year-old twins, had turned the night into a battlefield. There was no darkness they could bear, no sleep that could resist the call for a mother who could no longer return. Eduardo, a millionaire widower, had tried everything: experienced nannies, doctors, expensive toys, and bedtime stories, but no solution survived the dawn. The girls would wake up, cry, and only calm down with someone by their side. And even then, sleep was fragile, broken. That's when Julia entered that house. She didn't arrive with diplomas or modern techniques, but with something rarer: the calm of someone who knows how to listen. She carried in her hands a simple little flute and a worn fabric book, as if she brought, along with them, a piece of herself. On the first night, she didn't promise miracle. She sat on the floor beside the bed and played the flute softly, telling stories made up on the spot. Minutes later, Leah and Lara fell asleep with one hand on her knee. Eduardo, at the door, couldn't believe what he saw. And that's how everything began to change. Not through a miraculous method, but through a simple gesture: being present. Because sometimes what heals isn't saying that everything will pass, it's staying while it hurts. Some houses seem beautiful on the outside, but carry a weight that no one sees. The silence isn't one of peace, it's one of absence. Since Helena left, Leah and Lara, the 4-year-old twins, lost their sleep and part of their childhood. The millionaire widower Eduardo, accustomed to solving any problem with money, discovered that there's no fortune capable of buying rest for 2 children with broken hearts. Maybe you've already felt this, that sensation that no matter how much you try, nothing seems enough. Eduardo tried expensive toys, therapies, music on his phone, and nannies with years of experience. None stayed. It wasn't incompetence, it was because, faced with crying that's born from longing, only genuine presence can make a difference. The story you're going to hear today is about how the solution came unexpectedly. A simple woman, without an outstanding resume, but with a look that said, "I understand." She didn't come to take anyone's place, but to sit beside the pain and wait patiently until it calmed down. This story is about family support, about the presence that heals, about how affection and care build an emotional bond capable of transforming not only 2 children, but also a man who believed he had already lost the capacity to feel. It's about grief and overcoming, but also about love that remains and reinvents itself day by day. Stay with me until the end, because maybe you'll discover that the key to changing something in your life isn't in making more noise, but in remaining in the right silence. And who knows, you might realize that the greatest wealth of all isn't what's in the safe, but who stays by your side when everything else goes away. The nights in that house were long and heavy. Since Helena departed, Leah and Lara, the 4-year-old twins, lived in a state of constant alert. Any shadow, any noise, was reason to shrink and call for their mother. Eduardo, the millionaire widower, saw his routine transform into a sequence of interrupted dawns and tiring days. Their room was always lit, not by choice, but by necessity. Sleeping in the dark had become impossible, and even so, sleep didn't last. It was enough for one of them to wake up for the other to awaken too, and crying echoed through the house. Eduardo tried to divide himself between work and home life, but no solution seemed definitive. There were 5 nannies in 7 months. All gave up, not for lack of preparation, but because there it wasn't about applying techniques. It was about facing pain that had no manual. What Leah and Lara asked for wasn't in any contract. It was the presence of someone who wouldn't leave when dawn became difficult. The recommendation came from Ana Paula, the house's housekeeper. Julia didn't have a resume full of certificates, nor experience in mansions, but she brought in her gaze something that isn't learned in courses: calm. Eduardo, accustomed to analyzing people as if they were businesses, found that sensation of silent trust strange. When she entered the living room, Julia introduced herself with a discreet smile. She was 34 years old, simple clothes and serene posture. She told him she had cared for children, but always in a family context. When questioned about difficult children, she answered without hesitation, "I don't think children are difficult. They just scream when no one understands what they don't yet know how to say." That phrase broke something inside Eduardo. It wasn't a rehearsed answer, it was experience. Without promising miracles, she agreed to do a test that same night, and that's how an apparently ordinary woman took the first step to change everything in that house. Julia climbed the stairs with calm steps, carrying a small backpack. From inside, she took out two simple objects, a plastic flute and a worn fabric book. In the room, Leah and Lara were huddled in the corners of the bed, eyes wide, as if sleep were hostile territory. She introduced herself gently, sitting on the floor beside them. She said the flute played softly, like a heart with longing, and began to invent a story woven with the delicate sound of the instrument. There was no hurry, no pressure, just presence and listening. Minutes later, silence filled the room. It wasn't the silence of pain, but of calm. Eduardo, who was watching through the crack in the door, saw his daughters asleep, each with one hand on Julia's knee. For the first time in months, he felt a weight beginning to dissipate. In the following days, the house began to gain sounds that had disappeared. Laughter, little steps running through the corridor, conversations full of imagination. Julia didn't transform the home with grand gestures, but with small, consistent attitudes. She didn't speak in a childish voice, didn't force games. She just listened and encouraged the girls to speak and create. Leah and Lara began to invent stories of castles, dust monsters, and enchanted gardens. Julia accompanied them on the floor with scattered cushions and colored pencils around. When Leah drew their mother and said, "She has the same smile as you," Julia smiled without correcting, returning only affection in her gaze. Eduardo, accustomed to silent dinners, began to hear laughter coming from another room while he ate. He discovered he didn't need to call his daughters to be near. The sound of joy already traveled through the house, and this, gradually, also reached him. That night, a storm formed. The sound of thunder echoed loudly, and Leah and Lara, as always, reacted with fear. It was one of the most intense triggers since their mother's loss. Normally, this would end in screams and running through the corridor, but Julia did differently. She entered the room with a small lit flashlight, sat between the two, and told them that when she was a child, her father said that thunder was the sky trying to remember an old song. Then she began to sing softly, inventing a simple melody, inviting the girls to sing along. The crying decreased, their gazes became curious, and in a few minutes both were already nestled one on each side, listening to the gentle voice that lulled them. Eduardo, upon arriving, found silence, not that of absence, but of security. Eduardo began to notice subtle changes within himself. Before, he would arrive home carrying the weight of work and absence, but now he found a lighter environment. His daughter's laughter, the peaceful atmosphere, and the way Julia handled each situation began to break the rigidity he had built to protect himself from pain. He began to slow down. He took longer to leave home in the morning, found time to sit on the floor and play, and even turned off his phone during dinner. Without realizing it, he began to listen more, not just to his daughters, but also to himself. Eduardo understood that Julia wasn't just taking care of the girls. She was reteaching everyone in that house how to live simple moments. And this, silently, was returning to him something he thought was lost, the capacity to feel. Julia didn't limit herself to the basic routine of a nanny. She created small rituals that gave security to the girls, planting little seeds in the garden, inventing bedtime stories, preparing warm tea on cold nights. They were simple gestures, but they repeated, creating an invisible thread of trust. The garden, previously forgotten, began to come to life. Leah took care of the seeds, Lara was responsible for watering, and Julia accompanied them, patiently explaining how each little plant needed time and care to grow. Without realizing it, she was teaching about patience and hope. The house, which before was just a beautiful and empty space, began to transform into a home. It wasn't just about the garden flowers, but about the roots that began to take hold in the girls' hearts, and in Eduardo's too. One day, while organizing some old belongings, Eduardo found a small wooden box forgotten in the back of a closet. Inside, family photos and a sealed envelope with his name written by hand. The handwriting was Helena's. He opened it slowly, like someone who fears what they'll find. The letter was short but loaded with meaning. Helena asked that, if one day she was no longer present, he wouldn't let love die with her absence, that he give the girls presents and embrace, even with empty hands. Words that seemed to have been written for that moment. Eduardo realized that Julia, without knowing, had been living exactly what Helena wished. Not replacing, not erasing the absence, but keeping alive what really mattered, the love that remains and reinvents itself every day. As the weeks passed, Eduardo realized that Julia was no longer just the new nanny. His daughters saw her as part of the family, and even the house staff began to treat her with a different respect. She occupied an emotional space that couldn't be described with a job title. He then decided to be clear. He wanted her to remain there, not only for the impeccable care of Leah and Lara, but for the way she had brought life back to the house. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about the presence that heals, the patience that transforms. Julia accepted with a discreet smile, making it clear she would continue being who she always was, someone who doesn't promise happy endings, but remains even when the night is long. And Eduardo understood that sometimes this is the greatest proof of love. Julia never tried to replace Helena. Her strength lay precisely in recognizing the space of absence and not trying to fill it by force. She offered something more valuable: constant presence, attentive listening, and an affection that didn't seek recognition. The twins learned to sleep again, not because fear disappeared, but because someone stayed beside them while it existed. Eduardo, in turn, rediscovered that caring isn't just providing, but participating, being in simple moments, in silences, and even in tears. What Julia did in that house wasn't a miracle, it was humanity. And she taught everyone that sometimes what heals isn't finding someone to substitute what was lost, but someone who is willing to remain until pain finds a place to rest. How many times have you believed that the solution to a problem would come from something big and immediate, when in reality, what was missing was constancy and presence? The story of Eduardo, Leah, Lara, and Julia reminds us that you don't need to make noise to transform a life. You just need to be there in a genuine way. Maybe at some point you too have needed someone who would stay, even when there was nothing to offer besides silence and company. Or perhaps you've already been that person for someone. This is the essence of care, not trying to erase pain, but walking alongside it until the weight becomes bearable. And I ask you, in your life, who has been that presence that heals? And more importantly, for whom have you been that safe harbor? Reflect on this, share this story with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel to follow other stories that inspire and strengthen.